Hey, what's up guys? Anthony here, and in this video I'm gonna summarize Upstream by Dan Heath, how to solve problems before they happen. Now, this video guys is very relevant in this time frame because as you all know, we're moving towards very tough times with the whole corona crisis, and we're actually reacting to problems all the time right now. We can't do anything else. And Dan Heath is actually surveying. Obviously he wrote the book before the crisis, but it's very relevant today because it allows us to think about how can we, take proactive measures in order to prevent these crises and viruses to spread in the first place. So obviously I'm gonna make a connection and touch on this as well, okay? So let me start off with a quote from the book that really summarizes this whole topic, all right? So he says, Dan Heath, the author says, when you spend years responding to problems, you can sometimes overlook the fact that you could be preventing them. All right? So let that sink in for a moment, and that is actually the whole notion of the book. Years of our life, we are always reacting to problems, and we should start thinking about like, hey, if you have a problem, stand back, look at it, and say, how can we prevent this the next time? That's really the whole key of the book. And that specific action is what is called by Dan Heath upstream efforts. So an upstream effort is a preventive or proactive effort. It tries to solve problem before it happens, okay? While downstream efforts is just reacting to problems. That's the whole difference between upstream and downstream, all right? So I want to tell a story about Expedia that really summarizes this whole terminology, okay? So in 2012, Ryan ONeill was the head of customer experience at Expedia. Sorry for, that was a little difficult. So Ryan ONeill was the head of customer experience at Expedia, and as you all know, Expedia is a global booking platform for hotels, flights, rental cars, so you can book your international flight there. And what Ryan ONeill discovered, he did a very scary discovery in 2012. He discovered that for every 100 customers who booked on Expedia, whether that's a flight, a rental car, or a hotel, 58 of those 100 customers were calling after they're booked for help. So they're call and say like, hey, we need help or we need support. And this was a very costly problem for Expedia because if you know that on average, Expedia received around 20 million calls per year alone in 2012 at a support cost of $5 per call. That's almost $100 million problem. So obviously that's a very, very costly problem and it needed fixing. But the question was, two questions arise. Like, first of all, why did so many people call Expedia? Like almost the half of the bookers or the people who booked called Expedia. Why was that? And second of all, why did nobody at the company try to solve this issue before? Why did nobody took a preventive measure in order to fight this problem? So the answer to the first question, why did so many people place their calls? Well, that was really simple because Expedia didn't provide the itinerary. So that was a very painful problem because when you book your flight, most of all what you want to do is you want to print your itinerary or your schedule so that you know exactly when the flight leaves, or when the rental car, when you can take charge of the rental car or the hotel, when you check in. You want to know that information, and there was no way on the website to retrieve that information. So people called and asked for those schedules, and that was only discovered in 2012. So that was a painful problem, and what Ryan ONeill did is he looked at this issue, so he retrieved all the data, and he really looked at the issue from a broader perspective, and he said, okay, we need to fix this. So he assembled an emergency group, and they actually provided an online tool on the website in which customers could print their own itineraries. Okay, so they would not have to call anymore, and that was a perfect example because that was a perfect example of an upstream action, because I think in the book they say that today only 10 out of 100 customers still call for a support call after their booking. So that's a dramatic decline, and that's a typical example of an upstream or preventive action by Ryan ONeill. Okay, so that is a very classical example, and it just shows that you can solve major problems by actually, standing back, look at it from a broader perspective, try to keep your head at it, and fix it, okay, and prevent it in the first place. That's a pretty nice story from Expedia. So what I'm gonna do in the rest of the video is I'm gonna summarize the 3 barriers to upstream efforts. So why is it that human beings hate preventive action? Why is it that we're always reacting and not thinking proactively, trying to prevent problems in the first place rather than reacting to it? Why is that? Well, of course, we also need to take into consideration that reactive efforts or downstream efforts are often very easy for us, right? There's a problem in front of us, we want to fix it. That's easy. It's in front of us, it's tangible, it's measurable, it's easy. Upstream efforts, on the other side, are a little bit more complex. Why? Because obviously upstream efforts are not very tangible, they're more complex, and they require us to do systems thinking, and that's not what human beings like, because it's long term, it's out of our direct tunnel vision, it's long ahead, and we don't like to think about this, but we really need to if we want to be productive and save the economy's life, in this case in the corona crisis. All right, so that's obviously a first thing. Reactive actions are just more easy for human beings because it's easy, it's tangible, and it's narrow. All right, so I want to also make a claim that it's not that upstream efforts are always right. I mean, obviously we still need downstream actions. Like, look at the corona crisis. We all always want someone to rescue us when it's needed. Okay, so right now we obviously need the medical care and help of all the people in all the nurses that are treating the sick patients right now. So we obviously need them. So Dan Heath is not making a claim that one action is always better than the other. He just says, or he makes the argument that our attention and funding of these 2 kinds of efforts is asymmetrical. It's like, why are we spending so much time and money on downstream or reactive strategies rather than spending more time on upstream efforts? And with that I agree with him, because it's really, if you look what the corona crisis is going to cost the global economy right now, it's just maddening. And why are we not allocating a certain kind of budget to prevent these kinds of virus spreads in the first place? Okay, so I'm going to touch on that briefly. So let me look at it now. Let me look at the 3 barriers to upstream thinking. So number 1 is problem blindness. All right, so why are we not taking proactive actions? Well, the first of all is we need to see the problem. That's obviously most of the time the case, that if we don't see the problem, we can't solve it. All right, so in the book he uses the example of the New England Patriots, where before 1999 there were lots of hamstring injuries in the team of the New England Patriots. So New England Patriots is a football team in the United States, and when Marcus Elliott, a new sports coach, was introduced in the team, he actually looked at it at a very different approach. So he made a very individualized program for each player, and he actually figured out that as opposed to what the general consensus was by then, is like, football is a hard sport, injuries, these are inevitable. Injuries happen in football because it's a hard sport. We can't prevent them. It's just what it is. That's problem blindness. You don't see the problem. And what Dr. Marcus Elliott saw is that there was actually no personalized, individualized training schedule for each players that were at risk for hamstring injuries. So he came in, he actually made a very individual training schedule for every player, and he found out that the amount of injuries drastically dropped. So in order to take preventive action, you need to see the problem first, and not all the people see it directly. That's the first barrier to upstream thinking. The second barrier to upstream thinking is a lack of ownership. So what you need to realize is that with downstream work, the work is often demanded from us. Look at the corona crisis, right? Everyone is reacting because it's demanded, it's necessary. I mean, we need to save people's lives. But with upstream thinking or with upstream work, is that it's often, it's often optional. We don't need to do it right now. It's something in the future. So there's also a higher risk of a lack of ownership. Okay, so obviously there needs to be someone who's standing up and says, I own this problem, I want to fix it. And obviously because it's harder, it's harder for people to stand up in that way, and that's also what makes a lack of ownership more, there's a higher chance of a lack of ownership in that case. Okay, so someone must take charge and take ownership of the problem. And I'm gonna refer back as an example back to the case of Expedia, where why was it that nobody was taking charge of the high amount of calls before Ryan ONeill, the head of customer experience, came in and solved the problem? Why did no department or nobody at the company, said, hey, why is the amount of support calls so high? Like, why was nobody fixing that? Well, simply because nobody really owned the issue. Like, you had the product group, which goal it was to maximize the amount of bookings, so they were paid to maximize the amount of bookings. Then you had the text group, which goal it was to keep the website running and the reservation system running, so they didn't care about the volume of calls. And then you had the support group, which goal was to address the customer issues and help customers, solve their issues quickly and fastly. So they didn't think about the volume of calls either. And then it was only when Ryan ONeill came in and looked at the customer experience from a global, broader perspective, then it was he that had said, like, hey, there's something not right here, there's way too much volume of call, and we need to fix this. All right, so nobody really owned the problem. All right, that's a dangerous thing that's a critical thing when you want to address upstream, or you want to move upwards, or upstream, sorry. All right, that is the second barrier to upstream efforts: lack of ownership. And then the third and the last barrier to upstream effort is tunneling. And that's actually a very interesting thing, because researchers found, so what is tunneling? I'm going to explain it right now. Researchers found that when people experience scarcity, either in money, mental bandwidth, or time, they go tunnel vision. Okay, so they literally they fade out all the big problems and they focus on the little problems in front of them. That's exactly what's happening right now with the coronavirus. Everyone is reacting, and nobody's really able to set up the blinders and look at it from a global perspective. And that's also what's dangerous in these kinds of crises. We almost lose our minds because we're just reacting and looking in front of us instead of seeing the bigger picture. And that's the third problem with taking proactive measures. It's really lack of time, lack of energy, lack of resources, lack of money, or just lack of mental bandwidth. We crowd out the big problems and we focus on the little ones. Okay, so there's no long-term planning anymore, no strategic prioritization of issues. It's just what's in front of us. And I really want to link this to the corona crisis right now, because this is really relevant. Because look at what's happening in the world right now. All the medical, the people in medical care, or the nurses, they are obviously reacting to all the incoming patients, and they need to, of course. So I don't think that these doctors or these nurses have time to think about, hey, how could we prevent the corona crisis from happening again? No, they're just, handling patients and treating them, which obviously needs to be, but we also need to think about the bigger picture in these kinds of crises, because, how can we prevent these kinds of crises in the future? Some people need to analyze that, and there needs to be budgets and funding for these kinds of people researching how these kind of viruses can be predicted in the future. And that's obviously a very important thing. All right. So tunneling is also a barrier to upstream thinking, and we need to address this. Okay. So that's basically the three issues that we have in going upstream or going proactive. And I'm also gonna link the written summary in the description below. So if you want to check that out, go check it out. I'm not gonna dive deeper into this book because we're already talking almost 50 minutes, and obviously the video will be too long, I think. So in the book, Dan Heath also addresses 7 critical questions that leaders should ask themselves when they want to drive upstream actions. So he goes from how will you unite the right people, how will you find leverage, how will you change the system. It's very interesting, or I suggest you read the book or you watch the summary, the written summary in the bio. Okay, so I'll put a link in the description. All right, I hope you enjoyed this summary. I briefly touched on the book and its principles with my own, with my own touches here and there. So I hope this was helpful in a way. And yeah, guys, keep strong in this time. Stay positive, and we'll eventually take charge of this again. Cheers. Bye bye.